Q&A. And for the CL credit, I'm going to post it immediately after the talk. So Professor Rule, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you, Karam. And I assume everybody can see my slides. Are my slides visible on the screen right now? Yeah. Okay. Terrific. And then, okay, great. Well, I want to thank Chinonso, who's a good friend, and also Gina Warren and you, Karaman, for this invitation to speak with everybody today. This article that I'll be presenting on today will be published later this year in the BYU Law Review. It's focused mostly on state solar laws, which I think is increasingly important now as we have this growing uncertainty around solar energy policy at the federal level because of tariffs and investment tax credit questions and other things. But as many of you know, over the past few years, solar PV has emerged as, along with energy storage, as the fastest growing energy strategy in the United States. And this has happened mainly because the levelized cost of solar generated electricity has come down so much. It's also happened because of the federal investment tax credit, which was extended in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. And of course, there are state level policies that are aggressively incentivizing solar in many states. And then there's the fact that solar can be deployed so quickly. We have a huge, obviously, many of you are aware, there's a huge increase in demand across the country and even globally for electricity. And solar PV is great in that it can be deployed quickly. It can be deployed at really any scale and almost anywhere. So, and it's low carbon as well. So companies that are seeking to fulfill certain low carbon goals, they're actively pursuing solar for that reason as well. So there's a lot of reasons why solar is growing really fast. And this just gives you sort of the planned capacity additions from EIA for the coming year, for this current year. And it basically shows us that solar is growing about more than four times faster than wind in the U.S. and almost, 8 times almost faster than natural gas development. So really growing quickly. A small fraction of this is distributed solar, which would be rooftop, but the vast majority of it is utility scale solar, which are larger projects to export electricity off of the site for use by others. And prior to 2024, prior to the election, the NREL had predicted that about 25% of our new utility scale solar development would be on public land between now and 2020 and 2035. I think that's probably not going to happen now, at least not in the next few years. It'll probably be even lower than that, which means we're probably going to get 80 to 90% of our utility scale solar development will be on private land, given, for instance, day one, Trump put in his Unleashing American Energy executive order. He unleashed American energy by freezing all solar on development on federal lands for 60 days. Supposedly now that has resumed federal leasing for solar on federal land, although it seems to be moving pretty slow, partly because of just the chaos happening back there and just personnel gaps at the BLM and just generalized uncertainty about what the administration is going to do next. So really, private land is the place. That's where most of this utility scale solar development is going to happen. But regardless, as a public policy matter and from a developer's perspective, there's lots of advantages to doing solar on rural private land as opposed to public land. There's fewer environmental impacts usually because usually private rural land has already been cleared or it's being put to some other agricultural use, ranching or farming. And so building a solar project on this type of land is usually less likely to displace or adversely impact wildlife habitats or sensitive indigenous cultural resources, things like that. These private sites are usually also closer to load centers because private land tends to be closer into metro areas than a lot of the public land. Usually there's existing infrastructure more likely to be nearby roads and things that are needed for the development than you would see on federal land. It usually can be easier to connect to the grid, so you have less energy sprawl where you're building out transmission lines to connect into these remote areas. So and then also just from a developer's perspective, private land tends to be a faster permitting process on average, especially now. I think that's really true, particularly now, but it's always been true. And then of course, these projects really can benefit farmers and farming communities who can often lease their rural land at a much higher rate for a solar project than they can lease it for crop production. There's an interesting study that was published showing just asking farmers, how much have you been offered to lease your rural land for solar? And you can see really the interesting graph here is the fourth one showing you how even in 2021, only 27% of these farmers said they were getting $1,000 or more per acre to lease their land for solar. Now it's 58%. So the majority of these landowners in rural areas that are being approached to say, would you like to lease your land for a solar project, are getting offers of $1,000 or more per acre. By way of perspective, the average rental rate last year for cropland for a crop lease, agricultural lease, is $155 per acre. So farmers can make way more money in many cases leasing their land for a solar project than they can using it for to grow crops, which shows you what the highest valued use is of that land. It's not necessarily for crops. It's often it is for these solar projects, specifically if this land is close to transmission or other things that give it good access to the grid. The problem is that these rural solar projects on private land are running into increasing resistance. And it seems like a lot of that resistance is coming from politicized social media messaging. And just to sort of describe some of what this opposition looks like, there's just aesthetics-based objections. This is a rural community. We don't like the look and feel of the wind of the solar project. It disrupts the view on the horizon, the view shed. Fears of property value impacts, which I'll talk about in a minute. These myths about huge decrease in the value of land if you're located near a solar project. This fears about displacing agricultural production, that it's going to eat up all of our farmland if we put solar projects here. That sort of narrative, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This idea, that it's going to clear trees and that we're going to deforest to accommodate solar. There's some myths around that, narratives around that. Soil erosion, stormwater drainage impacts. The idea you put in a solar project and then when the storm comes, the grass is not going to be able to soak up the water, and you're going to end up having new flooding problems. And then these various concerns about other things, whether that be electromagnetic fields, the same type of arguments that have been made about smart meters or cell phones. This idea that electromagnetic frequencies are going to somehow, cause cancer, things like that. There's no evidence for any of that. Cadmium leaching, this narrative about how solar, has cadmium, solar PV, and that it's going to leach out of the solar panels and harm the land or contaminate it. Again, these are myths. There's really no truth to these, but the bottom line is that it's having an impact, because what we're seeing is a large number of counties, other municipalities throughout the United States that are passing or adopting really aggressive restrictions on utility scale solar development in their jurisdictions. And the USA Today published an article last year that said that there were at least 116 counties as of about a year ago that had these bans, and half of them had been enacted within the previous year. So this is a huge uptick. It's a trend that we're seeing. And what do these restrictions look like? Some of them are just outright bans on solar, utility scale solar. So Osage County, Kansas, for instance, has an ordinance that prohibits, quote, any new commercial solar project within the county's borders. Anything more than 30 kilowatts, which is not that many solar panels. It's just outright ban in Osage County. Some are caps on acreage. So Franklin County, Virginia, for instance, has a cap of 1,500 acres total countywide. Not very many acres for a county that size. So just basically saying we have 1,500 total acres in this county that have solar on it, no more will be permitted. Sometimes it's moratoria. We have counties like Lee County, Georgia. They adopt a moratorium with no defined end date, and then it just sits there. So it's almost the same thing as a ban. Or you have moratoria that are repeatedly getting extended. So it's supposed to be a temporary moratorium, and then they extend it, and then they extend it again. And so for developers, really that just means nothing can happen. There's restrictions on solar farm size. So we have counties like Butler County, Ohio, says no more than 40 acres for any project, any solar project, which is pretty small. And it would allow some development, but not a lot of the types of projects that people want to be able to build. And then just these setback requirements, some of them really aggressive. Kearney County, Kansas has a more than a quarter-mile setback. It's 1,320 feet from a neighboring dwelling unit. So you can't put a solar panel ground mounted within a quarter mile of a home in Kearney County, Kansas, which there's all these homesteads, and it really reduces the number of places where you can put these projects. Not sure what that's based on, because there's really not a lot of evidence that there's any risk to a homeowner anywhere near that distance. And then just the requirements that the basically screening requirements. They can't be visible from roads. They can't be visible from property line. And so what this has done, so here's just a map that USA Today produced showing you, 2023. There's more than this now, but it gives you a sense of where this activity is happening, not so much in Texas, but a lot in the Midwest in particular. There's this type of just severe local restriction on solar. So a little bit of historical context in this, and this gets kind of to the academic part of this. This is not the first time that local opposition to solar has led to a series of, or sort of a period of solar protections. And about a half a century ago, actually, back in the late 70s, early 90s, there were actually some states that enacted what are called solar rights laws. And these are state laws that preempt or invalidate local restrictions on HOA, or from an HOA or from the local government, and restrictions on mostly what we call rooftop solar, distributed solar. And so this was aimed, this was at a period of time when solar was relatively new, and there were lots of passive solar, so solar water heaters, things like that, people putting up on their rooftops, and it's sort of the first renaissance for solar energy. And the Arab oil embargo had been just a few years earlier, and there was a sort of this energy crisis that emerged at that time. And so there was this big push to try to promote solar as one way of trying to become energy independent. So these are a couple of statutes that were enacted around that time. This is in Indiana, enacted in 1981. A city or county, quote, may not adopt any ordinance which has the effect of prohibiting or unreasonably restricting the use of solar energy systems other than for the preservation or protection of public health and safety. It's pretty good, right? That might help to reduce some of these other restrictions in Indiana. You might hope it would. Nevada, this is in the 90s. A city or county, quote, shall not adopt an ordinance, regulation, or plan to take any other action that prohibits or unreasonably restricts or has the effect of prohibiting or unreasonably restricting the homeowner or the owner of a real property from using a system for obtaining solar on his property. So these look pretty good at first glance. Problem is that these were really designed, for most of them, for rooftop solar. And here's the definition of solar energy system, which is the sort of operative term in that Indiana law. It defines a solar energy system as a solar collector or other device whose primary purpose is to collect, store, distribute solar energy for space heating or cooling or for water heating. So these are not what we're thinking of, today with these ground-mounted panels, rows and rows of panels. It's not likely that these old legacy laws from 40, 50 years ago are going to be enough to protect solar farms today. And so that's kind of the point of this paper, is that we have this great local opposition now for not rooftop solar as much. Really, it's these rural solar farms, these utility scale projects. That's where we're seeing the big sort of opposition. And so what could we do? Well, in some states have taken action. Look at the states. We have California, Florida, Illinois, Minnesota, New York, and Michigan. In just the last 3 years, these states have enacted what I would call next generation solar rights laws. These are rural solar rights laws that are designed to protect a landowner, their rights to develop solar on their rural land. And so back, those old laws used to protect your right in suburbia or an urban area to put a solar panel up on your rooftop. Well, this next generation of solar rights laws seem to be more aimed at strengthening, protecting rights to put solar on rural land. And they're a little bit different, obviously, the way they're structured because the projects are different. But to give you a sense of these, you've got ones that simply say that if your project is bigger than 50 megawatts, then permitting is going to be handled by the state. And in California, that means likely that NIMBYism, that not in my backyard opposition is going to be thwarted by the state regulator who's going to come in and have a reasonable set of permitting requirements for the project. Florida, they use permitted use concept. So if you're in an agriculturally zoned land in Florida, then solar projects are a permitted use, right? It's basically treating like you're farming the sunlight. You could grow some other crop, or you could harvest sunlight, and it's going to be treated as a permitted use. In Illinois, you cannot impose a moratorium that's stricter or at all on a solar farm. It's not allowed, and you can't restrict it beyond a state standard that they've established, and that's similar to what they're doing in Michigan. And then some of these are just outright preemption, exclusive preemption language for projects of a certain size. And so this is what can be done, and these are great. There's an opposite approach that Ohio took. So about the same time period in the state of Ohio, that state's legislature basically gave express permission for local governments to restrict solar projects. So here's the Board of County Commissioners may adopt a resolution designating all or part of the unincorporated area of a county as a restricted area, prohibiting the construction of solar projects. So they expressly said, go for it. And within 3 years, at least a dozen counties in Ohio did just that. They went ahead and just banned solar in various ways, or severely restricted solar. And interestingly, in Ohio, there's a statute on the books also that expressly prohibits local governments from restricting fossil fuel development, such as fracking, because of course they're in the Marcellus shale play. So you have this situation where, who do you think was the originators of this opposition to solar in this state where the local government cannot restrict fracking, but they are specifically authorized to restrict solar energy. And in Michigan, actually, there's an interesting situation. They had 7 municipalities that had imposed severe restrictions on solar. And then in late 2023, the state legislature enacted a law that vested authority for large solar projects with the state. And then there was this big campaign by the fossil fuel industry linked advocacy group to raise money to try to gather signatures to put it on the ballot in last November. And they did not get enough signatures. And so that law remains on the books. But you can see, definitely fossil fuel interests are one of the groups that tend to be driving a lot of this opposition. And they're doing it by sort of manipulating these local communities and using misinformation about solar to sort of gin up opposition in many cases. So the main thesis of this is that, in states where there is no solar rights law yet for rural, states should consider adopting laws that would promote or that would protect against unreasonable local restrictions on solar energy development. And there's just some arguments that I make in this paper for why that makes sense to me. The first is simply that we already have lots of these these solar rights laws protecting your rights to put solar on your roof in many states. Well, rural solar deserves at least as much protection as rooftop solar does against local restrictions. If you think about it, rural solar costs less per unit of energy, per unit of generating capacity. Rural solar is usually more environmentally friendly in the sense that there's less supporting infrastructure, less supporting equipment like on top of your roof per unit of capacity in many cases. It's cheaper to put solar in a rural area usually per unit of capacity than it is to put it on a rooftop. And rooftop solar is arguably more likely to just be a visual annoyance because there's more people in an urban area where a rooftop solar might be visible to several people in a community. And a lot of these rural solar projects are kind of out in the middle of farmland where there's not as many people having to look at it every day. So just the fact that we already protect rooftop solar against unreasonable restrictions in many states, why would we not protect rural solar opportunities as well? Another argument that you hear, as I mentioned before, was this idea that there's a land footprint issue, that if we let people, farmers put solar on their land, then we're not going to have any food anymore, that it's going to use up all of our prime farmland. And these are just grossly exaggerated, patently false concepts. I can just back that up with this NREL study from 2022, for instance, which shows the purpose of this study was to say, what if by 2035, what if we went completely decarbonized? Our electricity system was completely decarbonized using wind and solar, land-based wind and solar, no offshore. What would that look like? How much land? What would be the land footprint? And the land footprint is that little orange box for onshore wind and the little green box for onshore solar or land-based solar. That's it. The broader box around the orange one that would be the amount of land that would be leased. But of course, wind turbines are spaced out, so they don't take up that much space. And then the solar is smaller than the total square kilometers of like a state like Massachusetts. So it's so less than 1% of our land would be needed to go completely wind and solar. So these arguments that, oh, it's going to use up all of our land and we're not going to have food anymore. Look at corn-based ethanol right now on that chart, showing you the size of that square. So it's almost roughly four times more land is used right now for corn-based ethanol than we would need to go completely off of carbon-based fuels to supply our electricity. And if you're worried about specific prime farmland, there's easy ways to manage that. For instance, Oregon already does this. Oregon has exemptions for what's designated as its most prime farmland, which is about 6% of the land in Oregon is protected. So in those lands have been, sort of excluded from solar development. And there's already designations for all this sort of prime land. And we could designate our most prime land that we really want to preserve. And we don't have to put solar on that land. There's still plenty of other land to put it on. So that concern about the footprint is just not true. This idea, that solar, it takes up a lot of infrastructure. Well, it takes up less if you do it on private land than on federal land. So some people are like, well, let's just put the solar way out on federal lands in really remote areas. Well, that means you're going to have to run transmission lines all the way there, and that's energy sprawl, and that's expensive, and that affects habitats where we could put a lot of this private land to use for solar, and it's much closer to existing transmission, existing hubs, existing roads and infrastructure for development. And so there's that advantage as well. This is sort of the libertarian property right argument. You often hear, very, socially conservative rural citizens saying, well, I want to defend my property rights. I should be able to use my land however I want. Exactly, you should. You shouldn't be subject to a restriction that says you can't put solar on your land. If that's the highest valued use for your land, if someone's coming and offering you $1,000 an acre to put solar on there and you can only get $200 an acre to lease it to someone that's growing crops, you should be able to lease it for $1,000 an acre. And why should somebody, at the county tell you no? Especially we're talking about rural land where we already have right to farm laws and other protections that give very broad discretion to rural landowners to do what they want with their land, as long as it's not creating lots of significant environmental hazards. But we let them fertilizer run off of their land and do all sorts of things that are more disruptive than having solar on their land. And then there's this property value argument that you hear is that, well, it's going to decimate our property values. There have been several studies done on this. The most robust study, it showed that it's barely statistically significant. In many states, it's not, that there be any impact on property values from having a utility scale solar project nearby. This is based on $1.8 million home resale transactions over a 17-year period. It's a very large, robust study by Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And the essential conclusion of it was there's really not much impact. We have property value impacts that are much, much larger from other farming operations. Just think of CAFOs, for instance, which are commercial animal feeding operations. Think the feedlot, the dairy, or whatever those places might be, pig farms, beef, whatever. This 2015 study found that the median property value decline to be within 3 miles of a CAFO, 3 miles, was a 26% decline in value. So that just completely dwarfs any of these potential impacts of solar in a rural area on your land. And you can't control it, whether there's a CAFO going in 3 miles away from you. If you get closer distance, like a half a mile from a CAFO, the declines in values are as high as 88%. So why do we have these right to farm laws that protect your rights to grow cattle, which are fine, but then why would we have those? Why would we then say it's okay for these counties to say you can't put solar in anywhere though, because it's going to hurt my property values? That again, just not a narrative that has any merit. And then lastly, what we can do now is we can increasingly use agrivoltaic technologies, and we're really working developing these that can help you actually co-locate solar with your ranching operations, with your agricultural crops that you're growing. And here in Arizona, there's several studies that the extension has done that are fascinating because we have a little bit too much sun, and a lot of the Sun Belt increasingly has this problem, and we don't have enough water. So there's interesting studies where certain, crops like bell peppers or things that normally couldn't be grown on the land, but then you put solar panels above them, and it creates some shade to limit excessive sunlight on the crop, which can't handle that much shade, that much sun, and it ends up increasing the crop yield. Number one. Number two, it conserves tons of water because you're shading the land, and so there's less evaporation, which means you have to do less irrigation to keep the crops growing. And then number three, the panels themselves, because of the irrigation that's happening below them, the panels are cooler. And solar panels in Arizona, the cooler they are, and especially 6 months out of the year, the more productive they are because they get too hot and they're less productive. So you get this amazing synergy where you can have increased crop yields, water being conserved, your panels are producing more electricity, and the landowner, the farmer, is getting more income. They have a steady stream of income that's actually far less volatile than the income from their crops, which, as we all know, there's price supports and different systems in place to try to protect them from the incredible volatility of commodity prices that farmers are usually subject to. And so lots of benefits are possible from allowing these landowners in rural areas to do this and investing in those strategies and understanding them better. So one thing I should say is it is admittedly hard to avoid the rural versus urban sort of tension in a paper like this. And so I just want to acknowledge it. I mean, it is true. If you look at the list of states that have adopted these rural solar rights laws so far, essentially all of them are states that have pretty large total land area and a large, one or more large urban areas in their state. Why do I say that? Because the urban representation in these state legislatures of these states is fairly large compared to the representation of rural voters. And that makes it easier, I think, for these types of restrictions on rural local governments, land use regulatory authority, to get enacted in those states because the urban representation tends to be stronger in some of these states. And so, so what do you say about that? Is this really sort of sticking it to the rural people and not allowing them to self-govern in those communities? Well, a couple of thoughts on that. One, I would say rural landowners have been the beneficiaries of some really favorable policies for more than a century. Many rural landowners, their predecessors acquired their lands through homestead acts. And the ideas of those homestead acts were to promote the productive use of those lands. So people had to go out and homestead the land for a certain number of years for them to be able to purchase it at a really discounted price or get it for free. And that's really what we're just trying to do with these rural solar rights laws is protect landowners' rights to use their land productively for the benefit of everybody. And the Rural Electrification Act, which is an act came out of the New Deal in the 1930s, it created all these low interest loan programs and other benefits that were all funded by taxpayers. And the idea was to support electrification of remote rural areas. And it really has benefited rural America and those landowners that had homesteaded those lands. And it was paid for by mostly urban people. And then we have the cross subsidization that exists between rural and urban landowners right now, which is that if you live in an urban area in many places in the United States, most of the United States, you pay the same electricity rates, postage stamp rate, pay the same rate for power if you're next door to the substation or next door to the power plant in suburbia that somebody who's way out in the country pays, even though it can be very expensive to run lines out to deliver that power to the person 20, 30 miles out on their own with low density. Much, much more expensive to provide power to rural areas than it is to provide power in suburban areas. But we have had this cross subsidy from suburban to rural for a century as well. And then the Farm Bill, the Farm Bill itself is large federal subsidies to rural communities. And so, this idea that this would be unfair to rural, I really think what we're trying to do is strengthen rural landowners' rights, promote the most efficient use of this land, and we can do it in ways that preserve our prime farmland and ensure that our food supply is not adversely affected at all. And then lastly, the thing about rural land as well is that landowners in rural areas have larger carbon footprints. It's always been true. The largest carbon footprint per capita is in Wyoming. Most of the states with landowners having the highest carbon footprints are rural states, and that makes sense, right? Because you have to drive a farther distance wherever you go, and their land density is lower, so this leads to higher carbon use. And so, in summary, the idea is just that we could benefit the whole country from opening up this land, protecting landowners' rights to develop their land the way they want. And if that's with solar, then we treat that like we would any other crop. We allow them to develop it as a solar farm. There's lots of precedent for this type of law, these types of preemption laws for other types of LULUs, what are called locally undesirable land uses. For anybody who studied land use law, for instance, affordable housing is the classic example, right? We often see preemption of local restrictions on affordable housing because there's a larger state level policy goal of promoting it, and it tends to be subject to these NIMBY problems where you have local opposition to the development. And so we've seen what happens when you don't do this in Ohio, as I described. Leaving these communities open to these types of restrictions invites disinformation campaigns, political tribalism, and other things to drive unreasonable restrictions into these communities that harms the communities and harms the state as a whole. And so my hope would be that we would move toward more of the types of laws that we're seeing in that 6 states that I showed you, and that other states in the country would adopt rural solar rights laws or enact them at the state level through legislatures. I would love to develop a rural solar rights model statute for that purpose eventually, and try to help promulgate this so that more states can take advantage of the benefits of protecting their rural landowners' rights to use solar. And with that, I will yield some questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Rue, for that really interesting conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So I'm going to take a look at the chat and see if there are any questions. Also taking questions. If you have any, please make sure you submit them in the chat so I can repeat that. But Professor Rue, I wanted to get your views on the stronger protections that you mentioned in the article for oil and gas extractions when compared to solar energy development like you have in Ohio. What might explain for this policy discrepancies? Is there any economic or political reasons that might explain why states usually have stronger protections for oil and gas extractions when compared to other renewable projects?
Yeah, I can only speculate. I don't have hard evidence of why you would have in Ohio these laws that prohibit local governments from restricting fracking, and yet the same state legislature enacts laws that empower the local governments to restrict solar. It seems to me to be senseless to do that. My speculative answer is that the state legislature is highly influenced by the fossil fuel industry in the state, meaning that the majority in the state legislature and in the state government is in favor of promoting fossil fuels. Because if you think about it as a public policy matter, you just evaluate it that way. We know that hydraulic fracturing has lots of harmful effects on neighbors, potentially, whether that be property value impacts, or whether it be groundwater risks, wastewater injection risks that can create seismic issues. So there's lots of documented potential harms from fracking. Not that we should prohibit fracking, but it just seems odd that with solar, where it doesn't cause any of those things, that we would restrict it. The only explanation would be political, I think, that I can think of.
That's interesting. Now I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about you said solar farms should be treated more like agricultural uses than industrial uses from a zoning perspective. Do you think any potential downsides to this in terms of future development in that area?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is different. And so I'm making sort of trying to frame solar as an agricultural use in with some of that language. And the reason why I think that is helpful is that these lands are low density lands. They're out far away from lots of other people, and many of them are not even zoned at all, right? And so you have these moratoria come in, and there's not very many other people out there are nearby, right? So our sort of typical approach in many rural areas is kind of more laissez-faire, right? We sort of let the landowner decide what is the highest use of my land, and so long as you're not dumping, hazardous, toxic chemicals into the water supply or into the ground or something, or emitting it into the air, then we let you do what you want with your land. We let you put it to its highest use, and as opposed to, in most industrial development is closer to something, has neighbors nearby, and many of those, if you're putting, say, a natural gas fired power plant in a somewhat rural area, you're going to have a smokestack. It's going to be emitting stuff into the air. You're going to have a pipeline feeding it into there, with potential fire risks. You have lots of other disruptions, and also the visual impact is greater from something like that. It seems more industrial. It looks industrial. Solar is it's visible often on the horizon in a rural area, but it doesn't have the striking impact typically that you have of a large smokestack facility. So trying to just help us frame it for what thinking about from neighbors' perspective, what it really is, and then from also the farmer's perspective, because with these projects, it's a harvest, right? It's not that different. It's a sustainable use of the land where you're going to harvest a resource, which is photons from the sun, to generate revenue for the farmer. And how is that really all that different? You grow a crop of corn, that's kind of what you're doing. You're adding water to it, but otherwise it's not that different. You're using the sunlight to make the corn grow. You're feeding it with some things, but then ultimately you harvest that corn. It's just a different product than electricity, but in many ways it is like a farm product, arguably.
So I'll follow up with one question. Then we have about 2 questions in the chat. And I think my next question is somehow related to the point you just made. So in terms of the specific misinformation, because it appears that a lot of this misinformation about the utility scale solar projects are sort of based on misinformation, what they read on the social media, and opposition or sort of like anti-sentiment towards renewables. Would you have you encountered what could be the major sort of source of misinformation that's sort of like driving this sort of like opposition towards utility scale? Because it looks like a number of the reasons you mentioned were quite unreasonable. Do you think this has to be like cues that local citizens take from maybe political leaders, or on both sides anyways? Does that have any impact on how people respond to these renewable projects?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it is definitely driven by national politics for wind energy in particular. I think that there's, within, conservative circles, that there's a lot of misinformation about the impacts of wind farms on birds, causing cancer, hurting your property values. A lot of that narrative, which is unsupported in the facts, comes through the national media. But I don't think I think it's much more, my impression is that it's much less centralized for solar. Sometimes the farm lobby wouldn't have a reason to love solar, because again, it's driving up rents for cropland in rural areas. So it's competing with agricultural interests in that sense. But also I think just in local communities, I think that there's often a fear of the unknown. And so it makes these groups very vulnerable to influence groups, and sometimes it's a Facebook. There's evidence of like Facebook groups that are appearing that are sort of funded by advocacy groups with connections to like the fossil fuel industry, and they're able to get in there, and people are afraid of the unknown. If their land is not the land that's getting leased, then think about what happens. Suppose your neighbor is getting their land leased, and they're going to start getting a 5-figure check every month. And so they're going to be able to take a nice fancy trip to Fiji next year. And they bought the 80-inch flat screen and the new pickup truck. And you always had historically been sort of on the same economic level as that neighbor. And now suddenly they have this additional income and you don't, right? So that's kind of a threat to sort of the social structure in that community in these tight-knit rural places, right? So even that, and it's not acceptable to say, well, I don't want you to get your solar lease because you're going to have more money than me. So,
Right.
but these types of narratives are nice proxies, sort of reasons to argue against some of these projects.
That's interesting. So I have a question in the chat about two. I'll probably take it one after the other. The first one says, what type of storage abilities do we have for solar energy derived from, or what type of storage abilities do we have for solar energy derived from? For example, rooftop solar cells. I don't know if you want to take that or you want me to just give you the next one so you take it all together.
Sure, give me the next one. Yeah.
Okay. The next one says, have you seen states begin to enforce their laws aimed at protecting utility scale solar? It goes on to say, I have seen situations in Illinois, for example, where counties seem to be sticking to their ordinances that restrict solar development beyond what the state regulation allows.
Oh.
Maybe the counties are waiting for state enforcement, but it leaves developers in an awkward situation. Now, developers often don't want to fight the county and risk making an enemy of the counties in which they want to develop. These
Yeah.
are the two questions, yes.
So that's a great question. So on the storage question, I think what they're just asking, some such concerns about the intermittency of solar and that we need to have, a base load, dispatchable energy source so that we, where solar at night, sun goes down and we don't have electricity during those times. Well, we have seen dramatic increases. I showed one of those earlier slides in battery storage capacity, and the cost per unit of storage for batteries is just dramatically decreased, about 20% per year over the last 5 years. So really dramatic drops in those prices. And I think as we continue to reach a production economies of scale, we'll see those prices continue to come down. And as we tap into more of our lithium resources and just build up a supply chain for that. And so even already right now, we're seeing huge amounts of storage development particularly in California, Texas, Arizona, and Nevada and Oregon. And so these states are and that's really what you do, right? You get usually 4-hour storage to get you over, there's what's called the duck curve in California or the Southwest, where in the evening, the sun goes down and people still have a high energy demand. And so what this 4-hour storage allows you to do is get over that hump to where you reach the evening hours. And so I think that, we're rapidly improving our energy storage capacity. A lot of people have distributed energy storage. I do, like I have a couple of Tesla Powerwalls at my house. I get many days, like today, I'll get over 100% of my electricity from solar on my own rooftop. I drive an electric car to and from work. That's completely run off my solar. And I have 2 Powerwalls. And so I literally could go off grid if the utility would let me. And so in places like Arizona, if you have a decent sized roof, you don't really need a grid anymore. We're just paying these fees because utilities provided that infrastructure before. And so it's not true everywhere, but in much of the country, it's getting to that point where, we're not very far off from having that and prices continue to come down. On the Illinois question, I don't know the specific context of that. It's interesting to me, and I have to look more into it. I wasn't aware of what this person was sharing about how these counties, there's a perception by this person that the state is not enforcing its own laws related to, protecting, rural landowners' rights to put in solar. I don't know much about that, and I don't know what to say other than, if that's true, then bringing that up with contacting the state authorities and seeing, why that's happening, and sort of pointing it out. I don't know, why that wouldn't be being enforced there, but that obviously a law is no good if it's not being enforced.
Okay, I don't have any other. Maybe I'll just put in one last one and then we can disperse. So you mentioned about states coming in, sort of like implementing or even initiating regulations or even laws to sort of prevent counties from having this laws that restrict renewables or like solar projects. But what of states where you have state legislatures sort of like implementing laws like you have in Texas, some of them restricting some renewable energy projects? Do you think we might use, or what other options might we adopt in those states where the reverse is the case, when we're seeing the states implementing such restrictions that prevent solar projects like of this nature?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, you'd have to go to the next level and try to preempt it at the federal level, which won't happen. So those are problematic. Those types of states. We've seen that, for instance, trying to protect military air bases. We've had some states where they put these radius restrictions around military air bases that are really unreasonable, that prohibit wind development for huge swaths of their state lands, or of their state's lands, because they're trying to protect, the military installation there. And in many cases, just an updating of the military's radar, just upgrading it, is able to fix that for a relatively low amount of money. But there's not a lot of incentive for military to pay for that. So my point is, yes, that is a problem. There are states that if they get captured by interests, whether that be, military or fossil fuels or the farm lobby or whoever it might be, and they decide that they want to try to exert their power to make it harder at the local level to put in these very socially beneficial projects, that is an ongoing threat. And I think it's probably greater today than it has been in the last few years, those types of threats. Certainly right now, at the federal level, with the rhetoric that we're hearing and the changes that are happening in the EPA, DOE, it's pretty amazing that renewable energy continues to go apace in this country, despite all of the headwinds that are being thrown at it. And that's really because the economics are so good for renewables. And so even with all the opposition that they're getting, we're still seeing the vast majority of our new energy is in the form of solar, storage, and wind. I think that's likely to continue. I don't think that that these government powers are going to be able to completely stop that. All they're going to do is just slow the progress on this transition, which is just going to harm people throughout the country, both economically and in their health. So it's unfortunate that we have that those influences are slowing the energy transition. But ultimately there will be a transition, because it doesn't really make any more sense to use coal. And even natural gas is increasingly difficult to justify as energy storage prices decline, and it takes so long to get a natural gas plant up and running these days, and we wanting to move much more nimbly in developing. So I think we're going to continue to see solar and storage in particular grow across the U.S. On private land. It's just at what pace will that happen, and how quickly will we be able to deploy these technologies and actually benefit the American people?
Well, that's true. I totally agree with you, Professor Rule, that the energy transition can be stopped now. We just have to keep going. I don't see any other questions, so I will bring us to a close.
And Professor Roll, I have just one question, maybe just maybe not directly related to your paper, but what about in generally to this solar industry? What about the security side? Like many senators and others talking about security side, like most of the solar panel, even that like for wind energy, the materials came from China. So it is to issue with that. Like we switching the dependency from, like we previously depended on oil in the Middle East. Now we changing the dependency on China. And China, like many times, use it against Japan and others. And how we could respond in kind of this is really concern. And also there's a human right concern, like in terms of for example, slavery, modern slavery, and all stuff. So these are also kind of things that people who are against solar and solar industry raising these kind of concerns. So if it's not, we just not like, for example, focus on the rural area, what about these kind of concern as well?
Yeah, that's a great point. I appreciate you bringing so much more broadly about solar, generally in the U.S. and it's where it comes from. And you're right that we have been heavily dependent on imported solar in China, accounting for much of that, or other parts of Southeast Asia. And so there's a few things. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, it included provisions that give an adder to the investment tax credit for domestically sourced materials. So when you use domestically sourced solar panels, then you're able to get a higher tax credit, right? So that was an effort by in that bill to try to promote the development of basically onshore the supply chain for solar panels. And I think that's something really important that we do need to do. I think that solar is one of those things, along with batteries, that we really do need a U.S. industry for. We need to find ways to incentivize and promote the development of that industry. And there are other places you can get solar panels from, but you're right that China's got the cheapest solar panels. So I think the one difference I would say, though, is, you put up solar panels and they're going to be good for 25, 30 years. They're going to produce free electricity once you put them up, low marginal cost, very low marginal cost electricity for 20, 30 years. So in that sense, if we buy them now, look at Australia, they have in New South Wales, they got like 30% market penetration. 30% of the houses have solar on them now. And those houses have the solar. So they're not dependent on China, those 30% of the houses, because all they're dependent on is the sunshine. So it's not like we're importing coal from China or gas from China or oil from China. We're just getting the panels here. Once we have the panels here, then they produce energy independently of China. So in that sense, I think that the argument's not quite as strong as it used to be about, Arab oil or some of these things that we've been concerned about. But I fully agree that we need to find ways to promote through policy these important supply chains, and that requires expediting permitting, which the Trump administration is trying to do right now. I think that's really important for mining. We have to be able to mine, lithium, copper, some of these critical minerals. We need to be able to mine more quickly here in the United States, cobalt, nickel. That's really important for us, and we need to expedite that and make that happen so that we can become more energy independent in this new world of renewables.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Troy. Thank you so much for coming. So on behalf of the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center and the co-director, Professor Gina Warren, and all of us here, we say thank you to all of you who participated, and thank you also once again to Professor Rule. And hopefully when we call you again, you will join us.